Hello, welcome to Mountain Momma Classical, the podcast where we bring classical Christian education to the hills and hollers of West Virginia. I'm Josiah Batten. I'm the headmaster of Emmanuel Christian School in Clarksburg, and I'm joined by
Kodey Watkins, one of the logic rhetoric teachers of Emmanuel Christian School. Today we're going to be talking about the question. I'm sure a lot of our families we've had for a number of years as we've transitioned from one thing to classical Christian education, as well as our new families that are prospective families, asking the question, what is classical education? What is classical?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most people have probably heard the term classical. You've heard of classical music or you've heard of classical art, right? You could probably name some classical artists if you can just name the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Classical refers to the total culture that's derivative of the ancient societies, particularly of Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Rome. And that culture expresses itself in philosophy and in legal systems and in medicine and in art and architecture. And all of that together we kind of refer to as classical.
So for families who have been with us for some time and they still don't understand it, what do we mean by we're changing to classical education? Like our primary focus is classical education.
Yeah. In the classical world, education was influenced by this idea. There's a Greek word called paideia, and the New Testament actually uses this word in Ephesians chapter 6, when fathers are told to raise their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It's actually saying, raise your children in the paideia of the Lord. Yeah. And that's kind of a loaded term. That's like saying, raise your children in the democracy of God. Democracy is a concept we write volumes. Right, you can read Winston Churchill's The Great Democracies, and that's a multi-volume series where he's talking about democracy. Paideia is really the same way. Raise your children in the total, comprehensive worldview and moral system of God. Yeah. That's what we mean by classical. So, a focus on virtue and the formation of character. Yeah. More so than what might be considered other pragmatic ideals.
Yeah. So when we compare, let's think about like kids coming from the public school system to what we're doing here at Emmanuel. How would you compare those two things? Or is it comparable?
It's comparable in the sense that we're both trying to educate. Yeah. We both have things we want kids to learn. And historically, we had a lot more overlap. It used to be we could agree on teaching kids to read and write and do math. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, public schools are failing at that. And I don't say that to beat up on public schools. That's just the reality. I read an op-ed from the Harvard Crimson, which is the student publication at Harvard University, where a student at Harvard was arguing students at Harvard need to read a book. Yeah. That was their argument. We should be reading books. Yeah. And I'm like, when you've fallen that far where students at Harvard aren't reading books, right, or at least are not routinely reading literature, it's not really comparable. Our second graders don't graduate without reading books. Right. They don't move up to third grade without reading books. Right. So it's comparable in the sense, we ideally both want to educate, and there is a certain core of knowledge, reading, writing, arithmetic, which all students should have because those are the foundational academic skills. Right. If you don't have those, it's really hard to learn everything else. Ideally, we should have agreement on that, at least. Right. It's not comparable in the sense that we're self-consciously looking at the fact that every student that comes through our institution, that comes through Emmanuel, is going to stand before Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I care far more on that day that Jesus says to them, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," than I care about them scoring high on a standardized test.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, and I guess that kind of ties in something else we wanted to talk about, right? Which is not just classical, right? But classical Christian. Mm-hmm. So here at Emmanuel, we're a Christian school, very proudly Christian school, run by Emmanuel Baptist Church. So we wed those two things together because they weren't meant to be separated. Classical education and Christian, right, as the foundation of that. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So the culmination of classical civilization is Christian civilization. The climax of classical civilization is Christian civilization. You think about those four ancient cultures I mentioned: Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Rome. Right. Where do you see all of those come together in one cohesive story? The birth of Christ. Right. Christ is born in Israel. But it's not just Israel, it's Roman-occupied, Hellenized Israel, which is to say Greek culturally influenced Israel. That's what Hellenization is. And he immediately, after he's born, has to flee to Egypt, right? Every single one of those ancient classical civilizations come together in the birth of Christ. And that is something that's not just a little historical fact or something. That's actually what we see happening with the introduction of Christianity to the world is the purpose and telos, the goal of all of those classical ideals influences the development of Christianity, and Christianity then orients that ideal toward Christ and says, you guys had this idea of a logos. You were really bad at identifying who that logos was or what that logos was. But here comes John saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were created. He's saying Jesus is the logos. And to a Greek reader, to a Roman reader, they would understand John is making a claim about the cosmic identity of Jesus, that he is the one in whom all of reality itself makes sense.
I think it's also important, like when I'm teaching logic and rhetoric school, whether that's like Bible survey or the Greek language, right, or logic itself, like we're interacting with these ideas that philosophers back in the day were talking about, right? Our textbooks themselves bring them up. And then it is the job of, like it's my job, to show them how all of this is interconnected or with Christ, right? He is the foundation of all wisdom and knowledge, right? We cannot truly know things without knowing Christ. Colossians says he in him is all the hidden treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Right? So we're connecting those ideas for students. I remember in our Christian studies, like church history class, talking about that. The Greeks held to this idea of the divine logos, right? The sustaining agent of the entire universe. And the fact that John says to a Greek audience, it's Jesus. Right? The sustaining agent of the whole universe is Jesus himself. Which then, when we're talking about classical, when we're talking about classical Christian education, it's our job then to show the students, to show parents, none of this is in a vacuum. Right? We can't do math in a vacuum. We can't do philosophy in a vacuum. But everything we do is to point us back to Christ. Who is Christ? And how everything centers around him. And even how ideas could be wrong because they don't align with who is Christ, right?
Why do we reject communism? You know, well, there's a lot of reasons, a lot, but one of them is communism is explicitly atheistic in its worldview, right? And as Christians, we can't agree with that. I think this also gets into curriculum. A lot of people see classical Christian education and they wonder why we're adding the things that we're adding. Mm-hmm. Why are we adding in classes in logic? Why are we adding in classes in Latin? Why are we adding in classes in rhetoric? Right? And the short answer to that is we're focused on forming a soul. Right. We're dealing with a human. Right. We're not... So Catherine the Great of Russia, she was heavily influenced by Enlightenment philosophers, and in dialogue with one of these philosophers, she said, "You write on the paper, but I have to write laws on human skin, which is much more fickle and ticklish." Right? So you have to be much more careful when you're actually in that position, when you're actually shaping someone human, right? All of those curriculum elements are not just something we're adding on a la carte. Right. It's all central. We follow a sequence, and that sequence is oriented towards students coming to understand what is the point of all of it. Yeah. What is the point of all of it? So we start with grammar. In the center of grammar is Latin. The best way to learn English is Latin. Mm-hmm. English is 65% Latin and Greek. It's also a great way to think, because Latin and Greek are inflected languages and English is not heavily inflected. So students who study this are able to, they train their mind to make more careful distinctions that just a native English speaker who hasn't studied a more inflected language won't pick up on. Right. The central part of logic school is, of course, logic. We teach logic as a subject. Right. And then as students progress further, we want them to bring all of this together. We want them to benefit society. If a student learns all this, but can't persuasively and effectively communicate it, this education is to no one's benefit except that individual student. Right. They need to be able to bring that out, speak it, write it, state it persuasively, and that's what rhetoric focuses on. We don't want our students to graduate from here and become cloistered and live a life all isolated and insulated, focusing in on themselves. We want them to go out and act for the good of the city and the good of civilization. Right.
And I think that's something I really hit on a lot in logic and rhetoric school. You know, in traditional logic, you're looking at the formation of an argument or a classical syllogism, and they're always wondering, like, why do we have to do this? You know, and giving them the bigger picture of, well, one, when you can actually see the form of the argument, you can pick apart all the pieces of the argument, right? Which is going to help you down the road. And in traditional logic too, we're about to get into taking like statements that don't look like arguments and finding the argument in them. Yeah. Right? Which is going to help them actually in life, right? Oh, yeah. In everything they do. But showing the students like all of this critical thinking, all of this reasoning is actually to develop your mind, to develop your soul, not just to become a better citizen, but to become a better citizen geared towards glorifying Christ in all that you do. Right. Right. So we teach logic, and then the end of that, we teach grammar, which is the foundation. Then we teach logic, which is starting to ask the question of why and start to do the critical thinking. And then we teach rhetoric, and it's real fun right now. Rhetoric students are saying, like, why do we have to do speeches? Why do we have to do public speaking? And it's exactly like you said, for the purpose of communicating what you've learned. Yeah. And to do it well. Right? To persuade people with what you've learned. Everything you do after high school into the real world is going to be wrapped around that idea. Like if you're in a job interview, if you're a manager or something like that, you've got to be able to critically think. You've got to be able to discern arguments. Yeah. And you've got to be able to do it well. Yep. Right? So we want to actually prepare them as they leave here.
Right. You think of, the profound theological song, "This Little Light of Mine," hide it under a bushel, no. Right. I'm going to let it shine. Right. Well, we want our students to be confident in letting it shine. Right.
Right, exactly.
That's what we're orienting them toward, an end, toward a purpose. And part of that purpose is, yes, you go out into the world and you let your light shine before men,
Right.
as Jesus commanded us to do. And everything builds toward that. You start at the very end. What do you want from an education? What do you want? What do you want to achieve? You start there, and then you flesh out the rest, working backwards, kind of like backwards on a staircase. If this is the top of the staircase, what's the step before that? What's the step before that? What's the step before that? So in the classical tradition, that's the liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And they're both subjects that we actually teach. We teach grammar classes and logic, but they're also the tools of learning.
Right.
A student equipped with grammar can learn anything. A student equipped with logic and rhetoric can learn anything.
Right.
We don't have to teach every subject. It's not possible. There are too many subjects in the world, and not every student needs every subject. So we teach the subjects that are going to equip the students to learn anything, to go on. And, I say we're not oriented toward a more pragmatic goal, right? Our goal is not just to get kids into college or not just to get them a job, but students who are equipped to learn anything will be more effective at getting into college and getting a job. And we've seen that in the classical Christian education movement nationwide. As employers begin to encounter these students, they say, I want more like this. There is no shortage of news articles right now, headlines you could find right now, of employers lamenting the fact that students can't read, they can't write, they can't work independently, they can't follow basic instructions.
Right.
All of these things are headlines I've read in the last 2 or 3 months.
Right.
Not like
It's not fear-mongering.
it's not fear-mongering. This is what is happening.
Right.
We're putting students out into the workforce who can't read, can't write, can't work independently without someone telling them step by step what to do. And classical Christian education forms students who can read, write, act independently, look at a problem, and determine this is what I need to do to solve this problem.
Right. So we're getting a little long on time here.
Yeah.
If you had a minute pitch for, let's say, new families are watching this, listening to this, whatever. What is classical? Let's condense everything we just did these last 17 minutes into a 45-second, a minute pitch. What is classical and why is it Christian?
Yeah. Classical Christian education is the formation of the soul toward Christ through the great books in the liberal arts. The great books in liberal arts are what make it really classical, and the formation of the soul toward Christ is what makes it Christian.
Right. Awesome. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Good conversation.
Yeah.
Hopefully this is edifying and encouraging and also informative for all those who are checking this out. Thank you, Headmaster.
Thank you.